covering that place and time period. Even scholars who disagree with the ideology of the Round Table's writers are forced to use it as a source, such as anti-imperialist or Marxist historians.
What about influence through groups like the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Institute of Pacific Relations? You mentioned them briefly in your book, but not as vehicles of influence.
It is true that many Australian roundtablers were members of one or the other or both. Again, however, it is virtually impossible to find specific and concrete examples of something that can be called roundtable influence. Yes, undoubtedly they exercised influence of one sort or another, but who can say what effect they had? Again, it is something that is
unquantifiable.
Indeed it is.
Now this is a type of influence that Professor Kendall did not address in his research.
That's true, and it might be because it is less noticeable in a country like the United Kingdom, which in the Edwardian age had so many newspapers and journals covering affairs in Britain from such a wide variety of angles. That just wasn't true for the British dominions, including Australia.
Along with groups like the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Institute of Pacific Relations, you mentioned the Round Table's ties with the Workers' Educational Association, the WEA. What does the Round Table's interest in workers' education say about its wider ideals and objectives?
That's an interesting question, and unfortunately I don't spend too much time on the WEA in my book. What it shows, in my opinion, is the Round Table's interest in social issues and problems, issues affecting the British Empire on a social level, rather than a political level, though of course the two are related.
Wasn't Lord Milner also something of a social radical?
For his times, yes. He was involved with the activities of Toynbee Hall in London, which sought to alleviate the effects of poverty in the major cities. Lionel Curtis was another Round Table member who worked with social issues in his youth, before he joined the movement.
Professor Kendall mentions that the Round Table worked with the WEA in South Africa. What about in Australia?
Well, in Australia the first WEA branch was established in 1913 by a Round Table member named Loftus Leithley. Another member who had a prominent role was Meredith Atkinson, a lecturer at Sydney University and a president of the WEA in New South Wales.
I recently read through Meredith Atkinson's book, Post-War Reconstruction, which he published just after World War I. Are you familiar with it?
I've heard of it, though I don't believe I used it as a source.
It's a book he wrote for the WEA as a textbook for adult students, and he touches on a wide range of social and political issues. In the process, he uses other books written by Round Table members and the Round Table Journal itself as source material, some of it quite extensively. That qualifies as an example of Round Table influence, I suppose.
An attempt at one, in my opinion.
They didn't really have any qualms about trying to spread Round Table ideas so blatantly?
No, and I'm not sure why they wouldn't try to. There was nothing so sinister about their ideas.
Why were they so secretive then?
I wouldn't use the word secretive.
Maybe the word reticent is better.
Perhaps.
I wonder if you are familiar with this quote from the Lothian Archives in Edinburgh, which comes from the time when the Round Table movement was founded. The quote says, "As little as possible should be said about its existence or the objects of its activities."
Meaning the Round Table's existence, I presume.
And its objectives. Now the Round Table is admittedly an obscure historical subject. But is it possible that it's obscure because the Round Table's existence and the objects of its activities were not meant to be publicized?
Again, I don't think the Round Table had an agenda based on sinister motives. It sounds to me as if they simply intended to be discreet.
You may be right, but it does seem a little strange that one doesn't hear mention of the Round Table in instances when you would expect to. You mentioned such an example in your book.
What example would it be?
Professor W.K. Hancock, who we discussed briefly earlier, wrote a book called Australia in 1930. It's a landmark survey of Australian history that is still used by scholars today.
Yes, it is. Are you referring to the list of people Professor Hancock mentions in his acknowledgements?
That's right. There were 14 people listed, 10 of whom were roundtablers. But your average reader would never know that, because Hancock doesn't identify them or himself as a roundtabler.
I'm not sure why he should have.
Maybe because it's relevant to the arguments and ideas he presents in the book.
Relevant how?
Well, he did mention these people for a reason. It's not a coincidence that 10 of the 14 people were roundtablers. They had joined the round table for a common purpose, and they shared the same general ideals. Shouldn't readers of Hancock's book be aware that they have a common bond?
There's nothing wrong with knowing, but I doubt it would make much of a difference.
It may not make a difference, but it is an example of where the round table was not mentioned, when it could quite easily have been.
It was probably only a matter of discretion on his part.
My impression is that the round table is unusually discreet about such things. It's like having to pull teeth with these people.
Ha 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 ha. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to offend you.
That's quite alright. I'll give you 2 more examples of this phenomenon, and then we'll change subjects.
All right.
When Professor Kendall's book was published in 1975, it was reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement. The reviewer was Professor Nicholas Mansurg. Do you know who he was?
Of course. Professor Mansurg was one of the foremost Irish historians of the 20th century.
And a member of the Round Table.
Yes, that too.
In his review, Professor Mansurg never mentioned that he had been a Round Table member for more than 30 years. Isn't it odd that a well-respected historian would fail to tell his readers that he was a member of the organization that was the subject of the book he was reviewing?
It's a little strange.
My last example, and then we'll finish with one more subject. I'm sure you are familiar with J.D.B. Miller, another prominent Australian historian.
Yes, I know Professor Miller.
Some years ago I had occasion to write to him about the Round Table and its links with groups like the Australian Institute of International Affairs. After several months of corresponding with him, he revealed he had also been a Round Table member, an admission that took me quite by surprise.
You didn't already know this?
No, though I probably should have. I had compiled a list of Round Table members and sent him a copy of the list, which included a man named Bruce Miller. I had no idea that J.D.B. Miller and this Bruce Miller were the same person.
I see.
I felt at the time he should have told me that much earlier. Why would he want to keep such a thing to himself?
It was probably a misunderstanding on his part. He didn't know that you thought the 2 names were of different individuals. You had sent him the list that included his name, so he must have believed you already knew.
You could be right about that. Well, let's go over one more area before we end the interview. Your attitudes toward the Round Table come through quite clearly in your book, and you seem to have a favorable opinion of the Australian Round Table.
The surviving members were very generous and helpful towards me. I had no reason to feel anything negative towards them.
Your attitude toward the London Round Table seemed rather cooler, however. I noticed, for instance, that you dedicated your book to the members of the Australian Round Table, not the entire Round Table.
It's true that I did have mixed feelings toward the parent body of the Round Table movement, especially in its later years. For me it looked as if the dissolution of ties between Britain and Australia mirrored the dissolution of ties between the Round Table in Britain and the Australian Round Table. The London group came to take the Australian groups for granted, and that damaged the ties of friendship and camaraderie that had kept the Round Table network functioning. In the end, the London group didn't see the Australian groups as having anything worthwhile to contribute.
And that breeded resentment on the part of Australian Round Table members.
Of course it did. Even when the Round Table Journal was revived in 1983, there was no effort to restart the Australian groups, and only one member from Australia was invited to become a member of the reconstituted editorial board.
You feel they were let down?
I did, and they did too. And it was so unnecessary.
Thank you for being my guest tonight. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
The pleasure was all mine.